Hey, so I'm Sarah, and today I'm going to be talking to you about our recent paper examining the user understanding of the MetaQuest permissions framework. So it's clear that VR data introduces new privacy risks and utility benefits. Namely, VR devices require accurate, highly frequent collection of user data to ensure a pleasant experience. And this is because misrepresentations and delays in a user's view can lead to side effects like a decreased sense of realism, as well as medical side effects like nausea. So we know that VR data requires more frequent data features to be collected at more frequent sampling rates. And so at the time of our study, the most popular VR headset was the MetaQuest 2. So to kind of contextualize these claims within the context of the MetaQuest 2, we see that this device collects the user's hand, head, and body data, where, for example, hand tracking refers to these 26 points on the user's hand. And it collects it at more frequent sampling rates. So when we look at like a typical Android smartphone, it's usually capped at 200 hertz for sampling. The Quest 2 is capable of up to 1,000 hertz. And so we know that this data is going to be likely more sensitive, right, given this more frequent and more in-depth collection. So previous work has introduced some privacy side effects of that. So we've seen this data can be used to identify users, to identify their attributes ranging from physical to mental attributes, for example, cognitive load, to medical conditions ranging from anxiety to Parkinson's. And so this led us to want to investigate how the Quest 2 implements permissions for biometric data. Because permission systems are the primary mechanism by which users can control access to their data. And so in devices like Android, this probably looks pretty familiar, right? Every time a sensitive data type is requested, we see this pop up. And we know that the Quest 2, or the Quest more broadly, the operating system is built atop the Android open source project, which is like the base operating system for Android. So we expect that there's going to be a lot of parallels between these two operating systems, and thus in their permission systems. So we set out to investigate the Quest 2 permission source code, specifically in comparison with Android source code. And we looked at system manifest files, which are these operating system files that define the permissions that apps can request, as well as the user interface, which is how permissions are shown to the user, and it's kind of dictated by what's in these manifest files. So in terms of what stays the same, we see that all permissions that already existed on Android devices are implemented more or less the same on the Quest 2. So for example, for the record audio permission, which grants access to the microphone, we see that it is also assigned a protection level of dangerous in the Quest, which has these UI consequences, meaning this pop-up shows up that looks exactly the same, right? So we see that most things stay the same. However, there are some changes that are introduced, specifically surrounding these new sensitive biometric data types, so hand, head, and body tracking, where we see the introduction of a new global permissions flow. So it looks something like this in the settings page. You go in, you toggle this on, that triggers a privacy notice, and then you have to go do a little tutorial about how to click and scroll on the Quest using your hands. And so this is sort of similar to like a special permission in Android, where you have to go to the settings page and, for example, turn on Do Not Disturb for a given app. However, in Android, the special permission is dangerous. So that means every app has to accept this permission, right? Individually, the user has to go turn it on for Instagram and then go turn it on for Snapchat. However, in the Quest 2, this is not the case, because these permissions have a protection level of normal. So this is basically, we coin it like a ask once per device permission. So you turn it on once, and then it's all apps can access this data. So given the introduction of these new data types and new permissions flows, we wanted to understand how users were interpreting these permissions and data flows. And to do so, we conduct a semi-structured interview study with 23 participants recruited from a university campus, where we have them play on a real Quest 2. They use 5 different applications, the first of which acting as a control, so no permissions. The second 2 request access to the microphone, so we see that traditional Android pop-up permission for both. And the last 2 request hand tracking. So the first one goes through that global flow, and the second one just automatically is granted that permission. And so then we try to assess participant perception of data collection to see if they actually understand what data types are being collected, how they were being collected, why they were being collected. And this allows us to address our second research question, how users interpret Quest 2's collection of new biometric data types. And then we assess participant understanding of the permissions requests. So do users understand what they're agreeing to when they click that permission pop-up. For the microphone, do they understand the scope of those permissions? And more importantly, for the new hand tracking permission, do they understand the scope of that? And this allows us to address our third research question, how users interpret new permissions flows. So for our second research question, we see our first finding, maybe the most broad, is that many participants held major misconceptions surrounding VR data collection. Yeah, so these are some of the more extreme examples, but when we asked participants how they think the device is tracking their hands, one participant claimed that they thought it was through echolocation, and then a second participant just kept repeating, through my eyeballs, right? Through my eyeballs. So Clippy's going to pop up and give us some broader questions that we think this study poses. The first broader question that this brought about for us was that, is this really informed consent? Like, can a user who genuinely thinks that echolocation is helping determine where their hands are, can they make an informed decision about whether they want to share their data with a company? So we think it's worth investigating how we can help users understand how these technologies work so they can make how they can make decisions that fit their belief systems. Second, we see that while many participants recognized active tracking, few discussed passive tracking. So what we mean by active tracking are actions that directly reflect something that takes part in the game. So for example, you press a button in Beat Saber, you might, if anyone knows that game, you might like slash a block, and that's like an active tracking moment. Whereas a passive tracking moment is more when a user's gait is being tracked, for example, or when a motion around the space, like they're walking around a room, that isn't directly related to an action in the game is taking place. We see that users very rarely noted any instances of passive tracking. And so Clippy begs us to ask, can we better cue users to understand tracking? So we'll talk about a little bit later some of the methods that we suggest in the paper, but we think it's important for users to understand the scope of tracking that's occurring. So they're not just being tracked when they're pressing that button, right? They're being tracked all the time. Third, we see that experienced users in our study had a better understanding of the differences between immersive and non-immersive modalities. So what that begs in our, from Clippy is that data collection notification, maybe we should rethink whether that should only occur on first use, in particular on first use of a device. Because the moment that the users pick up that device, they might not have used a headset before. So they likely have less of an understanding of how this technology works. So maybe it's worth thinking about like reprompting users later on, specifically in these new modalities. Lastly, we see that participants often derive data collection mental models from interactions with previous technology. So for example, one participant knew that the device was accessing the microphone because they saw a little light, which they'd similarly seen on their tablet before. And we also saw that a participant who incorrectly assumed the device was tracking their heart rate because they'd used a device before that had, I think, looked like the controllers or the headset that did so. So this, we see that these previous indicators worked very well in this new modality as well. So we think it's worth investigating whether these permissions indicators for previous modalities are able to be reapplied for these new permissions, or what these new indicators should look like in this new modality, because it does not appear that the current indicators are very effective. So for example, one thing that we propose in the paper is maybe at the beginning of applications that are tracking users' hands, we should have a brief moment of pass-through, which is when the device shows the user's surroundings, so you can tell that a camera is being used. And then we could maybe presuppose those like 26 tracking items onto the user's hands, so they understand that those 26 points are being tracked on their hands. Okay, so as to our last research question regarding the permissions flows, so this one's actually good news. We see that our participants did understand this global permissions flow, so they knew that it was a global setting because they had to go to the global settings page. So this is good news. However, participants, while they did acknowledge the usability benefits of only having to click that button once, they were concerned about potential privacy overreach from a global permission. So several participants, for example, noted that they wanted to be asked several times, or that they were confused why that only took place once, and that it should have been for every game. So we believe that this opens up maybe a future research direction to explore beyond traditional one-time notification. So what should this look like in these immersive modalities where there is this, I would argue, more intense usability trade-off? It is pretty annoying, to be honest, to have to turn on and turn off hand tracking each time, but there is this very sensitive private data. Yeah, so just to summarize, we believe our results suggest VR platforms and applications should investigate and introduce mechanisms to help new users understand what data is being collected, when it's being collected, and what it can be used for. and that we should further investigate trade-offs of ask once per device frameworks. So yeah, thank you for listening. Happy to take your questions later.